I met him once in the capital. His scholarship is remarkable, no less than yours in your youth. Amelia Mason said brightly. Nicholas Gray, having just bid farewell to his companions, never expected to encounter the Queen in this remote countryside. His first impression of her was of a remarkably intelligent woman, his second, of a melancholic queen. Now, she appeared like a cherished young lady, playful and vibrant. Sensing her desire for anonymity, he obliged, stepping forward to offer a formal greeting. Greetings, esteemed sir. I am Nicholas Gray, fortunate enough to have once discussed poetry with the young miss. Is that so, Amelia? Steward Mason inquired, his expression intrigued. Yes, Alexander Windsor once took me to Virtue's Haven for tea, and I happened to meet Master Gray there, Amelia Mason replied casually, realizing she had perhaps said too much with Nicholas's companions nearby. Steward Mason, delighted to encounter a person of learning, observed the elegant and refined young man before him. His words were far from ordinary, and to earn Amelia's praise was no small feat. This Master Gray must be truly exceptional, he thought with admiration. Master Gray, what books have you studied? Nicholas Gray respectfully replied, I have perused various philosophical treatises, though my understanding remains superficial due to limited exposure. Poetry, however, has long been my pursuit, a source of solace and intellectual stimulation. Yet, it remains merely a scholarly endeavor. My true aspiration lies in serving the people, and to that end, I intend to delve deeper into the chronicles of the ancients. Steward Mason stroked his beard, nodding in approval. You are a young man of great talent and ambition. History illuminates literature. I recommend exploring the works of Ouyang Xiu, Wang Engshi, and other esteemed scholars. Their writings possess a grandeur and complexity, blending ancient and modern perspectives. Whether narrative or discourse, their style is truly distinctive. Father, if you wish to discuss literature, let's go to the refined gathering residence. It's not appropriate to hold such discussions on this dusty main road. Amelia Mason replied to her father with a smile. Ah, right, right. Minister Mason came to a sudden realization and said with a humble smile, we have delayed Master Gray. Please, go ahead, Master. Our family still wishes to enjoy the breeze here, don't we, Amelia? Nicholas Gray carefully observed Amelia Mason's reactions, unable to hide his affections for her. Heaven had finally granted him this opportunity to approach her, and he couldn't let it slip away so easily. I am in no particular hurry. I have just bid farewell to a friend and feel a sense of longing. Fortunately, I encountered you, sir, and Mississippi. Perhaps a brief conversation will lift my spirits. Don't think there's no one in the world to talk to, what harm is there in sharing a few words? Amelia Mason smiled brightly. Master Gray has a remarkable memory. Nicholas Gray responded emotionally, every verse of yours, miss, I remember vividly. Had I known, I would have gifted you a poetry collection. Perhaps then, I would be renowned throughout the land, Amelia Mason jested. Unbound by the palace's rigid customs, she was a candid young woman in the presence of her parents. Do you have a poetry collection, miss? Nicholas Gray took her seriously. Minister Mason and Madam Mason exchanged glances and chuckled softly. Minister Mason said, although Amelia reads extensively and possesses vast knowledge, she is quite indolent and has never bothered to write down even half a verse. Regarding poetry, she merely recites a few lines on a whim. Ultimately, she finds the literary style of ancient poets overly ornate, and she can't be bothered to add legs to a snake. Upon hearing this, Nicholas Gray couldn't help but laugh heartily. He saw Amelia Mason's face flush slightly as she turned to act coquettishly with her father. Her beautiful countenance and endearing demeanor captivated his gaze. The group continued to stroll and converse until sunset, when they finally bid each other farewell with a wave. Nicholas Gray stood there, watching her until her figure was completely swallowed by the darkness. He sighed, how could he ever forget such a woman? Explanation: the autumn wind blows a deadly chill, bringing sadness both coming and going. Shouldn't everyone be rejoicing over the happy news? Why worry until your hair turns white? The Hu people endure many hardships, like withered plants. The further I am from my homeland, the more my longing grows. Unspoken worries weigh on my heart, like a wheel turning endlessly within. Main idea, describes the vast, desolate, and cold sadness of autumn. The last two lines express the speaker's feelings upon leaving their homeland. The deadly chill in the first line refers to the overwhelming sorrow of autumn that one must suppress within. The Hu people were an ancient, cruel tribe that lived in northern China, Cheongsam, a long robe worn by men in China. Don't think there's no one in the world to talk to. What harm is there in sharing a few words? Poetry collection, a collection of poems from the story of a Chu man who, in a competition, drew a snake first but then added legs to it while waiting for the prize, losing to someone who finished a simpler drawing. It means to over-embellish or complicate things unnecessarily. Chapter 8, When the king is in trouble, indifference is not an option. Medium, the moon hung high. Alone in his chamber, Edward Windsor sat without a lamp, watching the soft moonlight spill through the window, dappling the floor like a painting. He wasn't one for such sentimental scenes, yet tonight, melancholy held him captive in the king's study, his gaze fixed on the cold moon outside, lost in the quiet solitude. Eunuch Lawrence Park cleared his throat, softly inquiring, "Your Majesty, shall I light a lamp?" Edward Windsor shook his head in the darkness. Eunuch Lawrence Park, how many days has the Queen been gone? Your Majesty, today is the 8th day. It was a question His Majesty asked thrice daily, making the answer automatic. What? Only 8 days? It feels like months. He hadn't realized parting would be so agonizing, time stretching endlessly. At court, he watched the sun, longing for its descent. After court, midday stretched into afternoon, filled with memorials and ministers, finally giving way to dusk. Only to be followed by a long, lonely night. If your Majesty wishes, I shall bring Her Majesty back tonight. Eunuch Lawrence Park, Edward Windsor's eunuch since childhood, could read his master's heart. Palace affections were fickle, rife with pretense. His Majesty's genuine affection for a woman was rare, he would strive to ensure His Majesty's happiness. Edward Windsor shook his head again. I granted her 10 days, I won't go back on my word. Palace life is too strict for someone her age. Let her enjoy Mason Estate for 2 more days. Yes, Your Majesty. Eunuch Lawrence Park was touched, near tears. Did the Queen miss His Majesty as much? Have the kitchens bring me some porridge. I'll eat later. The memorials were numerous, sleep would be late. His appetite had been poor lately, porridge might settle better. Eunuch Lawrence Park bowed and withdrew, quietly closing the door. Edward Windsor sat alone in the dark, his expression somber and distant. Tonight, he desired no consort. With the Queen absent, his heart felt hollow, a void he couldn't fill. A sudden crash from the window startled him. He rose, thinking the wind had caused it. Before he reached it, a dark figure flashed into the room under the moonlight. Shock gripped him. He started to shout, but a powerful blow landed on his abdomen, paralyzing his upper body. Years of martial arts training kicked in, he clenched his fist, blocking the figure's next strike. Before he could turn, another blow came from behind. He twisted, sweeping his leg low, eliciting a cry of pain as the figure stumbled back, crashing into his desk, scattering papers and ink. Hearing approaching footsteps outside, the figure leaped, striking Edward Windsor in the chest with a final blow. Edward staggered back, clutching his chest as blood spurted forth. As the footsteps neared, the figure hissed, "Consider yourself lucky. Next time, you won't be." Then, he vanished out the window. Edward Windsor turned, stumbling towards the door. Each step took 5 times the normal effort. Just as he reached it, darkness consumed him, and he collapsed into the arms of eunuch Lawrence Park, who had just entered. Who? Who is it, His Majesty, His Majesty? Eunuch Lawrence Park cried out in terror. No, don't reveal this, quickly summon the Empress back. Edward Windsor grasped eunuch Lawrence Park's hand, struggling to finish his sentence before his hands went limp, falling into unconsciousness. Eunuch Lawrence Park, having never experienced such a thing, trembled, his legs unable to support him. He quickly lit a candle, only to see paper and brushes scattered across the floor, His Majesty covered in blood. He cried out, then collapsed, turning to the entering court lady and shouting, "Someone quickly summon the royal physician." The pale-faced court lady, witnessing the scene, turned and fled in confusion. Soon, every light in the royal palace was ablaze, voices buzzing with speculation, the entire palace consumed by unprecedented fear. Amelia Mason, hearing the palace guards knock past the third hour, closed her book and had just lain down when the door creaked open. Grace Mason hurried to the bedside, urgently announcing, "Miss, quickly rise, eunuch Lawrence Park has arrived from the palace." Amelia Mason hastily sat up and dressed. In the hall, beside Lord and Lady Mason, a pale and frantic eunuch Lawrence Park paced back and forth. Upon seeing Amelia Mason, he couldn't hold back his tears. "Empress, please return to the palace with this servant." Seeing him like this, Amelia Mason knew something grave had occurred in the palace. Without further questions, she calmly turned to her parents. "Father, mother, due to urgent matters, I must depart without proper farewell. I shall return another day to pay my respects." Lord and Lady Mason, not daring to inquire further, nodded, anxiously watching their child, clad in the Empress's robes, climb into the carriage. "Amelia, take care." These were the only words they could offer. Amelia Mason forced a smile as she turned back. She couldn't be certain if she would ever have the chance to return to Mason Estate. Inside the carriage, Amelia Mason, observing the still weeping eunuch Lawrence Park, humbly inquired, "Eunuch, what has happened in the palace?" Eunuch Lawrence Park, fearfully looking at the Empress, sobbed, His Majesty, he has been assassinated." "What?" Amelia Mason gasped, her voice trembling, "What is His Majesty's current condition?" "Covered in blood, unconscious. The royal physician is examining him in the palace." Eunuch Lawrence Park choked on his sobs. Amelia Mason struggled to remain composed. "Has the assassin been apprehended? Have Prince Carter and Chancellor Adrian Blake been informed?" His Majesty was alone in the king's study. This servant went to the kitchen to instruct the head chef to prepare porridge for him. Upon returning, I found His Majesty lying in a pool of blood. He said he wanted to see the Empress, then lost consciousness. Amelia Mason's small face paled, her fingertips trembling uncontrollably. "Has there been no announcement from the palace?" "No announcement has been made. His Majesty specifically instructed against it." "All right, upon returning to the palace, discreetly summon Prince Carter, Chancellor Adrian Blake, and Master Gray. Inform them that it is by my personal invitation. Also, have His Majesty move to my inner chambers. Announce that I am slightly unwell, then summon the royal physician." Eunuch Lawrence Park nodded repeatedly. With the Empress's return, his panic subsided. Amelia Mason's small face, striving for a serious expression, seemed to have matured significantly in that instant. Autumn yielded to winter's swift arrival, and the mornings grew frigid. Amelia Mason entered the bedchamber, her gaze falling upon His Majesty, eyes closed, a faint flush upon his cheeks. Was this the same stern, reserved His Majesty? His face, pale as parchment, seemed fragile, barely able to withstand a touch. A mere 8 days since their last encounter, was this his way of welcoming her return to the palace? Gently, she embraced his waist, nestling against his broad chest, straining to hear the beat of his heart. The royal physician had confirmed the assassination attempt, a blade had found its mark, though thankfully, amidst the chaos, the assassin's hand had faltered. His Majesty's lifelong martial arts training and profound inner strength had mitigated the damage, leaving him with internal injuries that posed no significant threat. He would awaken within 3 or 4 days, the physician assured, though a month of bed rest was necessary. His Majesty's heart beat steadily, and she breathed a sigh of relief. "Your Majesty," Grace Mason announced softly, noticing the Queen's flushed face as she lay upon His Majesty, Prince Carter, Chancellor Adrian Blake, and Master Grey have arrived. Amelia Mason rose, gently wiped Edward Windsor's face with a cloth, and quickly exited the chamber. Within the celestial hall, Chancellor Adrian Blake sat at the center, his face etched with worry. Beside him, William Carter frowned, a look of self-reproach upon his face. Nicholas Grey, bewildered, glanced from William Carter to Chancellor Adrian Blake. "Greetings, Your Highness, Chancellor, and Master Grey," Amelia Mason addressed them with a dignified curtsy as she approached. The 3 men promptly returned the gesture and seated themselves on either side of her. "How fares His Majesty, Your Majesty?" Chancellor Adrian Blake inquired urgently. "His Majesty is, for the moment, out of danger. Chancellor, for the next month, the affairs of state will require your utmost attention. His Majesty's health is delicate, and we cannot allow further complications." Amelia Mason spoke with earnest concern. "Your Majesty, rest assured, I shall not fail in my duties. I pray for His Majesty's swift recovery." Turning to William Carter, Amelia Mason spoke solemnly, "Brother, you are well aware of His Majesty's situation. The army, the borders, the capital, the great city gates, these burdens will fall upon your shoulders." William Carter nodded. "Sister-in-law, I have been remiss in my duties. Just days ago, His Majesty and I discussed this very matter, and precautions were taken. However, we did not anticipate such swift action. In warfare, speed is paramount. He struck when our guard was down. This assassin must possess intimate knowledge of the inner palace to move with such ease." William Carter met Amelia Mason's gaze with a calm resolve. "I understand, sister-in-law. This will not happen again. You have my word." Amelia Mason nodded and turned her attention to Nicholas Grey, who remained silent, his head bowed. "Master Grey," she instructed gently, "I ask for your utmost diligence with all memorials. Please deliver them to the inner palace daily. There are matters I wish to discuss with you." "I shall obey, Your Majesty." He dared not raise his head, fearing his eyes would betray his heart. In the few hours they had been apart, she had transformed from a playful young noblewoman into a composed and astute queen. Did the heavens fear his deepening affection? Once again, he was witness to her brilliance, each encounter revealing a new facet of her character, while he remained a distant observer. "On behalf of His Majesty, I thank you all." Amelia Mason rose and performed a curtsy. "In the coming days, I shall feign illness and request the royal physician's attendance, feigning a need for His Majesty's care. This may lead to delays in state affairs and criticism from certain officials who might accuse His Majesty of being preoccupied with the inner palace. However, these are mere rumors. Whether we address them or not makes little difference. You've endured much hardship, Your Majesty," Chancellor Adrian Blake commended. Though young, the Empress understands the gravity of the situation. "A little hardship. For this palace is nothing. His Majesty's swift recovery is paramount," Amelia Mason said, her face etched with worry. "A kingdom cannot be without its king." Nicholas Grey stealthily glanced up, his heart aching for the tension etched on her delicate face. If he could, he would gladly sacrifice himself to erase her every worry. Seeing the dawn break, Amelia Mason rose and addressed them, "It's time for court. Rest assured, I will attend to His Majesty with utmost care." The 3 men nodded, took their leave, and withdrew. Inside the bedchamber, Grace Mason directed the palace maids to remove the clothing and place a small chaise lounge upholstered in damask beside the grand bed. "Does Your Majesty truly intend to sleep here?" a maid whispered. Yes, Grace Mason replied, instructing the maids to arrange the tea table strategically. The room now felt more spacious, allowing for easier movement without disturbing His Majesty. Satisfied, Grace Mason meticulously cleaned the room once more, lit some tranquil essence incense, and quietly departed. Outside, the royal physicians arrived with the medicine. Amelia Mason received it, dismissed the maids, and carried the bowl inside. Gently, she sat by the bedside and spooned a portion to Edward Windsor's lips. He seemed to react, opening his mouth to swallow, his brow furrowing at the bitter taste. Amelia Mason smiled tenderly. "Your Majesty, you must recover quickly. There are many decrees awaiting your attention. You also owe me 2 days visiting my parents. You can't break your promise. You must make it up to me. After this medicine, I'll read you stories, just like at Mason Estate when the wind would rustle the pages and you'd hold them down for me. You'd carry me on your back, buy me candied hawthorns, take the blame for my mischief, and patiently listen to my singing, even though I'm not very good. Your Majesty, didn't you want to hear me sing? I can also play the dan. When you wake, I'll sing and play for you." By the time she finished speaking, the bowl was empty. She carefully wiped the medicine from Edward Windsor's lips, but his eyes remained closed, though his brow had relaxed slightly. "Your Majesty, you care for His Majesty so well." Eunuch Lawrence Park had approached unnoticed, careful not to disturb Amelia Mason's intimate ministrations. Recalling her playful words, she blushed. "You flatter me, eunuch." Eunuch Lawrence Park shook his head, finally understanding why His Majesty had insisted on Lady Mason as his empress. "Your Majesty, you are truly good." The other consorts rejoiced at His Majesty's misfortune, but the Queen remained steadfast, her every action motivated by genuine concern for him. "Has anything else occurred in the harem today?" Amelia Mason inquired anxiously. "Nothing major, just Sophia Bennet and consort Zhao are a bit resentful after hearing His Majesty received care from the Queen this morning. As for Clara Thompson, she's at Serenity Palace, peacefully focusing on her pregnancy." Speaking of Clara Thompson's pregnancy, Eunuch Lawrence Park was truly perplexed. This was His Majesty's first child, yet he showed little interest. Despite it being joyous news within the inner palace, only His Majesty seemed indifferent. Wasn't that a bit odd? Amelia Mason set down the medicine bowl in her hand. "That's fine. Let them be angry if they wish. After His Majesty recovers, he can explain everything to them. These next few days, please, eunuch, ensure no one disturbs His Majesty's recuperation." "Yes. This old servant understands." "Your Highness, you are also tired. You needn't exert yourself further." "I'm all right. Thank you, Eunuch Lawrence Park. You may leave now. If anything arises, regardless of the time, you can always come to me," Amelia Mason instructed. Eunuch Lawrence Park understood and quietly withdrew. The room returned to its initial tranquility. Amelia Mason gazed intently at the still unconscious His Majesty, picked up a book, sat on the bed, and began to read softly. When the sun rises, the forest mist lingers, clouds return, and the caves brighten. This is the morning and evening in the mountains. Wildflowers bloom, emitting a delicate fragrance, trees flourish with abundant sounds, the air is crisp and cool, water flows, and rocks emerge. These are the 4 seasons in the mountains. Departing in the morning, returning in the evening, the scenery of the 4 seasons differs, and the joy is endless. His Majesty, is there truly such a serene and beautiful place in this world? Like a celestial realm. To have the chance to journey there once would make this life worthwhile. Explanation: when the sun rises, the forest mist hasn't yet dispersed, smoke and waves merge, appearing gloomy. Day transitions from gloom to brightness, dusk brings darkness. Light and darkness transform differently. This is the mountain's morning and night. When wildflowers bloom, a delicate fragrance arises, or the scent of lush trees. Autumn. Brings pleasant weather, winter fills the crevices with flowing water. These are the transformations of the 4 seasons in Lanjiasen. Departing in the morning, returning in the evening. A year, 4 seasons, different scenery, this is what makes the mountains so captivating. The poem above is The Old Drunkard's Pavilion, by Ouyang Xiu, 1007–1072, whose courtesy name is Yong Shu, and sobriquet is Old Drunkard, a Song dynasty poet from China. Ouyang Xiu was born in Luling, now River West Province, China. In the 7th year of Tiansheng, 1030, he placed first in the imperial examination. He held positions such as Hanlin Academician, Deputy Privy Councillor, and participating in political affairs. During Emperor Theodore's reign, he served as Minister of War, and upon his death, he was posthumously honored with the name Randy Orton. The poem describes the beauty of Lanjiasen, a mountain range in southwest China. Chapter 9, When the King is in Distress, One Cannot Remain Indifferent, Part 2, There are so many voices, arguing, and someone is nagging, asking something. Edward Windsor found it strange that at such a vulnerable moment, someone dared to be so irritating. He recognized their voices, and he was truly angered by their disturbance. He could still hear them, but everything was drifting away, slowly fading, until only silence remained, silence. He sighed in relief as the noisy chatter finally faded, then a gentle voice, one he'd heard many times before, spoke, "Sleep, Your Majesty. Your complexion is much better today than yesterday. I'm so glad. Sleep soundly, I'm right here beside you." He wanted to say he'd slept enough, but he couldn't open his eyes, nor could he make a sound. "Sleep, Your Majesty," the gentle voice said again. "Perhaps you'd like some water. Grace Mason, bring a bowl of soup." A hand carefully lifted his head and slowly fed him something bitter from a bowl. He couldn't tell what it was, he didn't have the strength to think. Then someone held him tightly, and the softness against his cheeks intrigued him. A faint floral scent filled the air, and a cool hand stroked his forehead, lulling him back to sleep, into a world where he forgot everything. When Edward Windsor finally regained consciousness, he found himself not in his own bedchamber, but in the Queen's, judging by the simple white drapes and elegant furnishings. A book lay open beside his pillow, and a daybed stood before the bed, as if someone had slept there during the night. 2 voices drifted in from beyond the door. Asterisk also a type of bed, physician, how is His Majesty? It was the Queen's voice, sweet yet laced with worry. Much better, Your Majesty. I just had the eunuchs help His Majesty with a rubdown. When they changed his clothes, the mark of a palm strike on his chest had almost faded. His Majesty is recovering quickly. Did the eunuchs come while I was asleep? Indeed, Your Majesty. You should take better care of your health. You can't stay up all day and night. I'm fine. There are more important matters to worry about than my own well-being right now. But please consider, Your Majesty, there are some matters in the palace that others cannot handle, especially while His Majesty is in this state. I understand, but there's no other way. Lord Grey will be here shortly. Then perhaps you could take a stroll in the garden to meet him and clear your mind. Staying cooped up in your chambers will only worsen your mood. Very well, physician. Edward Windsor wanted to know what was happening, but he was too exhausted to investigate. He drifted back to sleep. The palace drawing room was temporarily serving as the council chamber. Word was spread that the Queen was unwell and unable to visit the King's study, so Nicholas Grey was instructed to bring the memorials there daily. Duke Carter and Chancellor Adrian Blake also happened to visit for discussions. 5 days passed with no sign of His Majesty awakening. Amelia Mason, pale and terrified, checked on him every hour. Bearing such a heavy burden for the first time, she was understandably weary. As the days wore on, and her strength waned, she inevitably came to rely on Nicholas Grey for support. Every day, Nicholas Grey would brief her on court affairs, assisting her in reviewing and approving memorials. Observing her occasional melancholy, he would pause to engage her in poetry and philosophical discussions, subtly shifting her thoughts. When she displayed the gentle demeanor of a 16-year-old girl, he would fall silent, lost for words. His Majesty stirred slightly, and Amelia Mason immediately rose from the chair by the wide window and approached the bed. Gently settling beside him, she spoke in the soothing voice he'd grown accustomed to over the past few days. Would His Majesty care for some water? Her tone reminded him of a mother tending to her child. He yearned for her closeness, but a sudden, sharp pain pierced his chest. Seeing His Majesty wince, Amelia Mason quickly dabbed his forehead with a cloth. Then, she spooned a thick, viscous substance with a faint, pleasant aroma into his mouth. After he finished, she carefully wiped his lips with a damp cloth and softly hummed a folk song, lulling him back to sleep. His Majesty seems much improved today. Perhaps tomorrow, you'll be able to sit up and converse with me. Your Majesty, I have so many questions that require your guidance. She spoke as if musing to herself, tilting her head and pouting her lips. As dusk settled outside, she rose and instructed the maids to light the lamps. The open window revealed the shifting clouds, and Edward Windsor felt that if he looked up, he would surely see the sky and stars. Returning to the bedside with a lamp, she was startled to find him gazing at her with open eyes. Your Majesty, you're awake. Oh, heavens, she exclaimed, grasping his hand with tears in her eyes. You're looking at me, aren't you, Your Majesty? Nicholas Gray arrived later than usual, his expression grave. Amelia Mason thoughtfully instructed Grace Mason to serve him tea and refreshments before entering the drawing room. In the candlelight, he noticed the absence of a frown on her brow and a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Your Majesty, you seem particularly cheerful today. Seating herself gracefully at her desk and picking up a memorial, she replied cheerfully, His Majesty awoke today and was even able to sit up and eat. He's still a bit weak, and the royal physician insists on more rest. Nicholas Gray smiled. That is indeed wonderful news. Your Majesty, the burden on your shoulders can now be eased. You should enjoy some peace and happiness. Then, a hint of disappointment crept into his voice. I fear I won't have the pleasure of seeing Your Majesty as often. With him at court and her in the inner palace, there would be no reason for them to meet, no more shared poetry, philosophical discussions, or casual conversations. Amelia Mason looked at him in surprise, noticing a fleeting sadness in his refined features. She offered gentle reassurance, We shall meet again, Master Gray. We are both in the capital, not worlds apart. Nicholas Gray gave a wry smile. Perhaps being worlds apart would be preferable, then, he might one day find her. But in the capital, mere inches felt like a vast chasm. Your Majesty, have you grown accustomed to palace life? He ventured to ask. Horizon, the palace is more secluded than other places, reading and playing music here isn't much different from Mason Estate, just more rules and it's harder to go out. Amelia Mason's face held an innocent, unworldly expression, filling Nicholas Gray's heart with tenderness. Do you mind His Majesty favoring other consorts? Amelia Mason shook her head. No, the palace is meant to have a harem with numerous consorts, and His Majesty doesn't have that many. Why should I mind? Speaking to him, she dropped the formal air of an empress, no longer using the royal, but a simple, perhaps feeling like she was talking to a close friend. But you are in the bloom of youth, spending every night alone in a cold, quiet room. Don't you feel lonely? He asked, his heart aching. Time blossoms here refers to age, time blossoms like flowers means young age like blooming flowers. Amelia Mason's small face showed surprise. I've always had my own room since I was little, so it's no different now. Besides, I have Grace Mason and the palace maids for company. I won't be lonely. Nicholas Gray looked at her in disbelief, carefully asking, could it be that you and His Majesty haven't? He wanted to say, consummated the marriage, but it felt inappropriate. In truth, there was no need to ask. She was so innocent and beautiful, as naive as a young maiden. How could she already be a mother? Empress was just a title. In her essence, she was still the young miss of Mason Estate. But His Majesty clearly cherished her so much. Could it be that he only wanted her wisdom? Asterisk woman, from maiden to woman means. Haven't what? Amelia Mason asked, puzzled. Haven't discussed today's court matters with His Majesty? He felt a surge of joy for some reason and quickly changed the subject, afraid she would continue questioning. Did you discuss today's court matters with His Majesty? Amelia Mason's heart skipped a beat. Was there something important today? Nicholas Gray nodded. Today, an urgent report arrived from the border saying that 10 Mongol banners invaded our frontier. The garrison troops repelled them with great effort, but our soldiers suffered heavy casualties. They fear another attack and urgently request reinforcements from the court. What did Prince Carter say? Amelia Mason asked hurriedly. The prince is gathering provisions. After midday, he'll inspect the troops and the situation with the infantry. Troops should be dispatched by tomorrow morning. Oh. Amelia Mason breathed a sigh of relief. That's good. Which general is currently guarding the border? General Eleanor Bennett. Isn't that the eldest princess's son? A blush crept across Amelia Mason's small face. Do you know General Bennett? Nicholas Gray was surprised that the Empress, secluded in the palace, knew General Bennett stationed at the distant border. Amelia Mason smiled. When I was little, Grace Mason told me there were performers from another tribe doing amazing tricks on the street, and many people went to watch. I wanted to see, but Mother feared I'd get hurt in the crowd, so she wouldn't let me go. I asked Grace Mason to sneak me out the back. The performance was under a bridge, bustling with people. They were doing a fire ring act. I stood there mesmerized, and then the performer suddenly started playing with a long snake. Everyone backed away in fear, and I, being so small, was accidentally pushed into the river. Grace Mason screamed, and a young man passing by jumped in and saved me. He even took me to his home to change my clothes. After learning who I was, he smiled and brought me back to the performance, ensuring I saw the whole show before taking me home. Father later told me he was Eleanor Bennett, the eldest princess's son. I immediately remembered him. I never thought he'd become a general. Recalling the past, a joyful expression appeared on Amelia Mason's face, her eyes as clear as water. Nicholas Gray asked, slightly puzzled, did you never see him again after that? Indeed. Amelia Mason said regretfully, Master Yan's skills were exceptional, everyone watching praised him. After entering the palace, I learned Sophia Bennett was his younger sister. I wanted to inquire about him several times, but I couldn't bring myself to ask, as sneaking out and falling into the river wasn't exactly something to be proud of, right? She playfully looked up at him, a bright smile on her face. Nicholas Gray smiled back, you must have seen him as a hero. Yes, since I was little, I've especially admired knights and heroes, always wishing I possessed exceptional martial arts skills, galloping across battlefields, drawing my sword to aid friends. It seems I'm addicted to heroes. Huh, your ambition is quite grand. Nicholas Gray laughed heartily, amused by her heroic words. She blushed in embarrassment, then smiled along with him. Your Majesty, it's late. Lord Gray should return to his residence. Grace Mason gently opened the door and reminded her. Amelia Mason looked outside, indeed, without noticing, the moon had risen high in the sky. She looked apologetically at Nicholas Gray, Lord Gray, I'm so sorry for keeping you so late today. He looked at her intently, as if he hadn't finished speaking, no need for such formalities. It's rare to have such a pleasant conversation with your Majesty. My heart is filled with joy, and I didn't realize how quickly time flew by. It truly wasn't enough. Amelia Mason smiled, after His Majesty recovers and resolves the matters at the border, I'll ask His Majesty to take me to Virtue's Haven. I'll make arrangements with you and other scholars, and we can compose poems and match couplets together. Nicholas Gray sighed silently. The Empress was still young. Her previous visit to Virtue's Haven was to test the talents of the scholars, and it was also a matter of state affairs. Now, if she went for leisure, it wouldn't be in accordance with protocol. How could His Majesty agree? Looking at her expectant expression, he couldn't bear to burst her bubble and nodded with a smile. Very well, then I shall look forward to it. Your Majesty must prepare well, you can't cry if you lose. Humph, who says I'll lose? Amelia Mason said with a smile as she saw him off. Under the moonlight, watching his sleeves flutter, she thought, what a fine gentleman. She couldn't help but sigh. Since ancient times, talented scholars have been paired with beautiful women. The ministers in the court must be eager to form marriage alliances with Lord Grey's family. She wondered which lucky lady it would be. Once His Majesty recovered, she must ask him to investigate thoroughly. He shouldn't marry some ordinary woman, tarnishing Lord Grey's profound knowledge and talent. Your Majesty, please return and rest well. Don't read too late. With the Prime Minister and the Prince in the court, you needn't worry. His Majesty is much better today, so you can have a peaceful sleep. Nicholas Gray turned back and advised. Thank you, Lord Grey. I'll keep that in mind. Be careful on your way. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow, Amelia. Nicholas Gray called out silently in his heart, watching her graceful figure, no taller than the tree's shadow, before reluctantly turning to leave. Chapter 10, Unspoken Sentiments, A Bumpy Road Ahead, Part 1. For several consecutive days, His Majesty didn't attend court. The reason was that the Empress wasn't feeling well, so His Majesty had no mind to handle state affairs. The ministers in the court shook their heads and sighed when speaking of this. After all, he's still young and places too much importance on romantic affections. This isn't what a wise ruler should do. Remembering the late emperor, how he. Right as the ministers were steeped in worry, one man's face revealed a triumphant smirk. That man was the founding General Thompson. In the warm chambers behind the Thompson Estate Gardens, a lavish banquet unfolded tonight, the food and drink as opulent as the royal palace. Edwin Thompson even instructed the head steward to summon several courtesans from the Apricot Blossom House to entertain the guests. As dusk settled, Edwin Thompson dismissed all the servants, leaving only the head steward to manage the banquet. Soon, the guests arrived, 3 men. One, a shadowy, cold figure clad in black. Another, Prince Vincent Wilder. The last, a man long absent from the capital, Prince Sebastian of Fairhaven, Sebastian Windsor. Edwin Thompson respectfully invited Sebastian Windsor to the seat of honor. The shadowy man, noticing the beautiful women standing nearby, said with displeasure, "Vulgar cosmetics, get out." Overflowing with vulgar cosmetics, the women's smiles froze at his icy glare, and they looked towards Edwin Thompson. "Head steward, take the ladies to another room to rest. Bring them back later," Edwin Thompson said gently. Once the women departed, the cold, shadowy man visibly relaxed, taking a seat beside Sebastian Windsor. Edwin Thompson and Vincent Wilder sat on either side. Edwin Thompson raised his cup, smiling at the shadowy man. "Today, before our esteemed meritorious official, this old man offers the first toast." He drained his cup in one gulp. The man accepted the gesture, rising and emptying his own cup. Sebastian Windsor nodded with a faint smile. Indeed, a meritorious official. Otherwise, this prince wouldn't be standing so securely in this capital. This prince also offers you a cup. The man waved his hand. Your Highness, how can Lachlan accept a toast from you? Your Highness has shown me the grace of rebirth. Back in the Guang region, I was but a nameless nobody. Only through your Highness's favor, taking me under your wing, did I become the Lachlan of today. Alas, it's a shame that day, unfamiliar with the situation, I failed to take that person's life. I am ashamed before your highness. No matter. This prince is in no rush to take his life. A good scare is enough. Such a performance is more entertaining. A cruel smile spread across Sebastian Windsor's face. Edwin Thompson chuckled. Indeed, indeed. The play has just begun. How can it end so quickly? Vincent Wilder, bewildered, asked, who is this person? The three men burst into laughter. Prince Vincent Wilder, really? That person is that person. You just keep merrily drinking. Don't ask too many questions. Just wait for your time to enjoy the benefits, Edwin Thompson said. Vincent Wilder didn't press further. Their conversation was too convoluted for him to grasp. Prince Vincent Wilder, have you heard that the Empress isn't well? Sebastian Windsor asked, exchanging a glance with Edwin Thompson. Vincent Wilder was taken aback. The Empress's gentle, humble smile flashed before his eyes. Unwell? He shook his head. I haven't heard anything. His Majesty has confined me to home for recuperation. I'm unaware of outside affairs. If not for General Thompson's invitation to this banquet, I wouldn't even be out. Oh. Look at you, a subject so neglectful. The Empress is unwell, and you haven't immediately gone to the palace to inquire after her health? Sebastian Windsor said, his gaze sharp. Vincent Wilder shuddered. Would it be appropriate for me to visit the Empress's palace? Despite his naivety, he understood this much etiquette. Go in the name of the Crown Princess. Both the Crown Princess and Alexander Windsor were born to the previous Empress. Sebastian Windsor and Edward Windsor only addressed her as Crown Princess, not as their elder sister. Ah! A few days ago, Vincent Wilder had been reprimanded by his mother, so his enthusiasm for a grand future had waned considerably. He no longer wished to be in cahoots with Sebastian Windsor, but he couldn't find a good reason to refuse him. This Sebastian Windsor, having deceived His Majesty and secretly returned to the capital, was hiding who knows where, always sticking close to that guard, while Vincent himself was quite terrified by Lacan's cold, gloomy demeanor. Look, look, the food's getting cold, let's eat, Your Highness. Edwin Thompson said, exchanging a few cups of wine with Sebastian Windsor. Your Highness, are you settling in all right? Though it can't compare to Carter Manor, this small discomfort I can endure. It's you, General, who should be careful, and not let your joy show so plainly on your face, Sebastian Windsor said coldly. Edwin Thompson nodded. I understand. That person seems to still be unconscious. Many officials have been inquiring these past few days. Recently, Mongolia has been moving troops south, and the court is in a state of unease. Hearing this, a joyful expression spread across Sebastian Windsor's face. The heavens are helping me. General, we must seize this opportunity. Such a chance may not come again, and we cannot let it slip. Edwin Thompson raised his cup. Rest assured, Your Highness. The two men looked at each other and drained their cups simultaneously. Vincent Wilder sat to the side, bored, picking at his food. He had no desire to listen to their scheming and left early. Sebastian Windsor gave him a few parting instructions. He stumbled back to Carter Manor alone, afraid of his mother's questioning about his whereabouts. He quietly opened the back door in the courtyard, only to find his mother sitting alone beneath a large tree, gazing at the sky and sighing. Mother, why aren't you wearing a coat? He felt a pang of guilt as he snuggled close to her, embracing her. Chinger, what are you looking at in the sky? Vincent Wilder looked up. The autumn night was clear but cold, the stars seeming brighter and more distant than before, yet still visible at a glance. Why had his mother been staring for so long? Chinger, they say that after death, people ascend to the heavens and become stars, adorning the night sky and watching over their loved ones below. I'm looking for the star that is your father. Once I find it, I'll tell him that Chinger has grown up, become thoughtful, and can distinguish right from wrong, and that I no longer need to worry. Princess Rose Windsor spoke weakly. Mother. Vincent Wilder hung his head in shame. Don't say that. I'm unfilial and still cause you so much worry. Cheng'er, there are some things I cannot help you with. You must think carefully for yourself, about what can and cannot be done. You must be discerning. I've understood a little these past few days. They want me to visit the Empress in the palace tomorrow, saying it's because she's unwell. I don't know what their intentions are. Princess Rose Windsor turned to him. Is that so? Then go to the palace. We have some bird's nest from afar, take it with you. Try to see His Majesty. Don't you have something you want to tell him? Huh? Vincent Wilder looked at his mother in confusion, then immediately lowered his head and wept. I'm so useless. Princess Rose Windsor sighed and put her arm around his shoulders. My Cheng'er, though not exceptionally talented, is very loving towards his mother. He has many flaws, but he's never heartless. I'm truly happy, Cheng'er. I don't ask for you to achieve great things, only that you live well, find a gentle wife, and have a few children. That would be enough for me. Mother. Vincent Wilder bit his lip, weeping like a child. Previously, goaded by Sebastian Windsor, he believed in his own talent, never expecting to embezzle disaster relief funds. Not only was he chastised by His Majesty, but he also angered his mother. None of them stepped forward to shoulder any responsibility with him. He gradually understood he was merely a pawn in their game, and his heart filled with disappointment. Truly, he realized, if Sebastian Windsor were His Majesty, could he compare to the current emperor? Just one look at La Can at his side revealed his cruelty. Cheng'er, tomorrow, after the morning court session, quickly return to the residence. See His Majesty. Say what you want to say. He won't blame you, understand? Yes. Vincent Wilder nodded seriously. The two watched the stars for a while longer before returning to their rooms to rest. Amelia Mason didn't quietly return to the bedchamber until the third watch. Fearing Edward Windsor wasn't fully asleep and that she might wake him, she foolishly continued reading outside. Only after Grace Mason urged her several times did she close her book. The room was unlit. She fumbled her way to the bed, bending low to check if His Majesty was sleeping soundly. Unexpectedly, she met a pair of deep, profound eyes. Your Majesty, she whispered. Do you want some water? He shook his head, struggling to lift his hand and gesture towards the bed, saying with difficulty, You sleep. Amelia Mason shook her head. Your Majesty, this subject can sleep on the daybed. I'm afraid of touching your wound on the bed. Rest assured, this subject will be very close. If you stir even slightly, this subject will awaken. Edward Windsor shook his head again, stubbornly pointing to the bed. Amelia Mason's cheeks flushed. Resigned, she put on her outer robe and climbed onto the bed, carefully sliding past him to lie on the far side, remaining motionless, afraid to brush against his chest. After days of medication, Edward Windsor's body carried a strong medicinal scent. She was accustomed to it. She pulled the blanket over him. The autumn air was cool, but it wouldn't do for him to catch a chill. Edward Windsor pushed aside the corner of the blanket she had just placed over him, lifted it slightly, and said with effort, Come here. Ah. Amelia Mason hesitated. Sharing a blanket, how could she be certain she wouldn't touch him? What about his wound, which had finally closed? But His Majesty was stubborn, perhaps worried she would be cold. She thought for a moment, then said, Your Majesty, can this subject bring the blanket from the daybed and sleep here? That way, you can see this subject. If you can't sleep, this subject can tell you stories. You don't need to respond, all right? In the darkness, a smile played on Edward Windsor's lips. Amelia Mason carried the blanket from the daybed and carefully lay down. The bed was large enough, but lying next to an invalid still felt somewhat constrained. Amelia Mason tried her best to steady her breathing. She quietly observed His Majesty lying beside her. His eyes were bright as stars, seemingly without a trace of sleepiness. Although she was 16, having entered the palace so young, Amelia Mason was still somewhat bookish and naive about romantic love. She had read much poetry and prose, and knew such exquisite affections existed in the world, but she was still young, and such things didn't seem to apply to her. For many days, she had attended to His Majesty day and night, simply fulfilling her duties as Empress, without any extraneous thoughts. Now, lying in the same bed with His Majesty, she felt uneasy, a little shy. Your Majesty, there are times when I feel conflicted. I hope for your Majesty's swift recovery, yet I also fear it. Your Majesty's awakening signifies improved health, but the weight of state affairs will burden you, causing fatigue. If you remain unconscious, I fear even more, for a nation cannot be without a ruler. Ultimately, I am but a woman, unable to sustain things for long. Daily, I must worry about the livelihood of the people, the harvest, the merchants' profits, the ministers' disputes. My head feels thrice its size. Being your Majesty is truly arduous. The smile on Edward Windsor's lips widened. Fortunately, several ministers assist me, otherwise, the state of the country would be dire. Your Majesty, do you recall our meeting before the wedding? You asked for my help. I thought it would be simple, reviewing memorials and ledgers. I didn't realize being queen was so demanding. Your Majesty, did you misjudge me? I am not as capable as you thought. Perhaps we should find another queen, and I can return to Mason Estate. Absolutely not. Edward Windsor frowned, speaking through the pain. He growled, even if I die, I will hold your hand. In this life, don't even dream of such a change. After these few words, he was panting, his eyes as if wanting to devour her. Amelia Mason hurriedly soothed him, as long as your Majesty doesn't regret it, I, though useless, will do my best not to disgrace you. All right? She treated him like a child needing comfort. Edward Windsor closed his eyes, regulating his breathing, his mood calming somewhat. He suddenly flung back a corner of the blanket, extended his arm, and called out, "Come here." Amelia Mason sighed, lifted the blanket, and slipped into his embrace. Finally, he held her, her small frame, her faint floral fragrance, his queen. Your Majesty, I haven't touched your wound, have I? Amelia Mason asked anxiously, carefully finding a suitable position in his arms. I'm tired, Amelia. Let's sleep. He nuzzled his head against her neck, a smile gracing his lips as he closed his eyes. He called her Amelia. Amelia Mason was taken aback. Perhaps she misheard. Today had been eventful, and she was also tired. She let out a soft sneeze, nestled against His Majesty, and fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 11, Unspoken Affection, A Rocky Road Ahead, Part 2. As the first rays of sunlight entered the room, Edward Windsor slowly opened his eyes. He stared at the canopy for a long moment. The burning and heaviness that had plagued him for days were completely gone. He felt more relaxed than ever before. He looked down to see Amelia Mason, still in her outer robe, sleeping soundly against him, her face bearing the innocent expression characteristic of a young woman. He carefully shifted his body, attempting to sit up. It was quite difficult, and by the time he managed to grit his teeth and sit upright, he was breathless and panting. With his movement, the light blanket slipped down. He blinked, gently draping it back over his beloved. Overnight, her hair had come undone, her delicate features relaxed. Unaware of what she was dreaming, the corner of her mouth curved upwards, and she let out a soft murmur. A feeling of unprecedented tenderness welled up within him. He remembered how, when they first lay down, she had stiffly kept her distance, afraid to touch his wound. But in her sleep, she had unconsciously moved closer, embracing him tightly, finding a comfortable spot in his arms before peacefully drifting off. From childhood to adulthood, he was perpetually trapped in a sense of dread. Towards this world, each day upon waking finding himself in a state of combat readiness, constantly fearing that a single slip-up would ensnare him in a trap. He never dared to hope that someone would genuinely care for him. The palace maids and eunuchs were kind to him because of his status, the queen consort and the high-ranking officials disdained his existence, his presence or absence holding no significance for them. It wasn't until he inexplicably ascended to the throne that they began to offer him fawning smiles. Behind those smiles lay hearts colder than ice, a sight he couldn't bear to look upon. Now, many showed him kindness and loyalty because he was His Majesty, not because he was Edward Windsor. Only in her eyes, whether he was His Majesty or Edward Windsor, did it not matter. She consistently used her small, frail shoulders to bear a portion of his burdens, genuinely caring for him from the depths of her heart. Therefore, from the very first day, a tall, imposing man like him unconsciously relied on her heavily. He extended his hand, tenderly wanting to touch her. His Majesty. Eunuch Lawrence Park entered the room and, upon seeing His Majesty half reclining on the bed with the Empress sound asleep beside him, his eyes widened, completely forgetting the reports he intended to deliver. Since His Majesty's adulthood, he had never witnessed any consort by His Majesty's side in the early morning. Previously, when His Majesty visited consorts like Clara Thompson and the favorite concubine, he would return to his own bedchamber by midnight, never spending the night. Yet today, lying beside His Majesty was none other than the Empress. How could he not be astonished? This was the Empress's chambers, but wasn't the Empress still sleeping in the side chamber? What had happened today? Edward Windsor, finding Eunuch Lawrence Park's stunned expression somewhat amusing, gently gestured for him to remain silent and waved him away. Astonishment was clearly etched on Eunuch Lawrence Park's face. He nodded, about to retreat, when he unexpectedly bumped into Grace Mason, who was entering with a basin of water. Grace Mason, not anticipating anyone in front of her, tilted her hand, and the basin crashed to the floor with a loud bang. Both of them cried out in surprise. Amelia Mason, startled awake by the noise, blinked sleepily. First, she saw Edward Windsor's stubbled chin, then realized she was embracing him. Startled and surprised, she abruptly sat up, reaching out to touch His Majesty's chest. His Majesty, are you all right? Before Edward Windsor could respond, Grace Mason, who was cleaning up the mess, looked up and saw the Empress sitting on the bed, her hair disheveled and her clothes rumpled. She gasped, abandoning her task and rushing to the bedside. Your Majesty, quickly get off the bed. Amelia Mason, hearing the commotion, stretched out her hand and asked in confusion, what's wrong? Look at you, you look like a disheveled village woman. How can you let His Majesty see you like this? Grace Mason whispered in exasperation, then pulled her towards the mirror behind the bed. In this palace, which consort didn't adorn themselves like flowers before fluttering around His Majesty? Only her mistress. Her just-woken expression was so foolish, and she was still asking questions. Ah! Only then, seeing her disheveled appearance and rumpled clothes in the mirror, did Amelia Mason blush crimson with embarrassment. Mothers always taught their daughters to be presentable when meeting others, it was a matter of courtesy and self-respect. How could she have forgotten? Oh dear, His Majesty had seen her in such an unsightly state. Her small face crumpled slightly in mortification. My queen, you have a truly attentive handmaiden. Edward Windsor observed Amelia Mason undressing, washing her face, and combing her hair behind the screen, speaking casually. Indeed. Sister Grace Mason grew up with me. With her here, I make fewer mistakes. Amelia Mason's hair cascaded down like a waterfall as Grace Mason deftly applied cleansing oils, then quickly helped her change into her robes, her entire body unintentionally revealed to Edward Windsor through the screen. He wasn't a naive young man, he had taken several concubines over the years and no longer felt the stirrings of youthful passion. Yet today, the Queen's every natural movement made Edward Windsor's breath catch in his throat. His Queen had truly blossomed. Finally, she emerged, refreshed and graceful. His gaze lingered on her, wanting to call her to his embrace, but mindful of the two other people in the room, he restrained himself. Eunuch Lawrence Park, convey my decree, invite Prince Carter and Chancellor Adrian Blake to the palace. Furthermore, Master Gray need not attend the king's study any longer, appoint him Imperial Academician. Eunuch Lawrence Park acknowledged the command and withdrew, followed by Grace Mason after tidying the room. Alone with her. She approached the bed and sat, looking at him with bewilderment. Why shouldn't Master Gray come to the king's study? These past days, I've relied on Master Gray's assistance to manage state affairs without error. That is precisely why I'm promoting him. Keeping him at the king's study would be a disservice to his talents. Edward Windsor narrowed his eyes, his voice devoid of emotion. The Queen conversed with the top scholar so cheerfully and naturally, like old friends. She maintained decorum, but the top scholar's eyes revealed much. He wasn't a magnanimous man, his Queen's eyes should hold only him. Oh. Amelia Mason nodded, seemingly finding his reasoning sound. She didn't dwell on the matter, picking up a cloth from the table to wipe his face. Shortly after, the royal kitchen delivered their breakfast. My Queen, once these matters are settled, we shall return to Mason Estate for a few days. He heard her murmuring, and Amelia Mason blushed. Your Majesty, the royal palace is a place of great importance. Such casual departures are inappropriate. If the other consorts were to learn of it, your Majesty would be placed in a difficult position. It would not only invite criticism and tarnish your reputation but also lead to accusations that I lack decorum. I appreciate your Majesty's kind intentions, but my earlier words were merely idle thoughts, not to be taken seriously. His Majesty had been mysteriously targeted, and she felt danger lurking everywhere. If such an incident could occur within the heavily guarded royal palace, Mason Estate offered even less security. Moreover, His Majesty had been injured for days, causing a backlog of state affairs. With the Mongol forces stirring at the border, his recovery would only mean more arduous work. But I wish to dote on you. Gently caressing her soft face, Edward Windsor couldn't contain his affection. Amelia Mason's eyes shone with a shy light as she took his hand. Your Majesty, if you truly wish to favor me, once you've fully recovered, please visit the other consorts. They might harbor resentment knowing your Majesty remains in my chambers. Your Majesty cannot allow me to be the cause of such discord. In this world, only you could be this foolish. Edward Windsor sighed, closing his eyes. Other consorts schemed tirelessly to keep him close, yet she constantly pushed him away. If he didn't clarify things, who knew how long her naivety would persist? He was a man, a little boldness wouldn't hurt. My Queen, come here. Amelia Mason's eyes widened, her face flushing as she approached and sat beside him, her gaze anxiously fixed on his chest. Amelia, how many years have we been married? Edward Windsor lowered his voice, bending down to whisper against her neck. 3 years. His Majesty's intimate behavior made her uneasy, her heart pounding like a drum, its rhythm still erratic. Amelia, it's time we became husband and wife in truth. Ah. Her mouth dropped open, her expression a mixture of shock and apprehension as she stared at him. True husband and wife, during the wedding ceremony, she'd heard the whispers of the attendants, the implications of what it meant, but she hadn't truly considered it a reality. But now, His Majesty, saying such things, could it be, today, his gaze burned with an intensity that threatened to consume her, leaving her feeling strangely weak and adrift. She yielded as he drew her into his embrace. She didn't know how it began, but his kisses fell upon her face like a gentle rain, tracing a path from her cheeks to her neck. Growing bolder, he lifted her face, his tongue parting her lips, delving within with a fervent hunger. Amelia Mason, unfamiliar with such passion, gasped softly, her cheeks burning as she leaned closer against him. After a long while, he reluctantly released her, his voice husky. Amelia, when I've fully recovered, let us officially become husband and wife. What do you say? No. She smiled, shaking her head shyly. What? He gripped her shoulders in disbelief. Why not? Like the gentle ripples of autumn water, she sighed softly. My lord, no, Edward, since entering the palace, my mother has told me that my husband wouldn't be an ordinary one. That I would need a tolerant and generous heart to navigate the days ahead. A woman of humble origins, with a spirit as fierce as a raging fire, would surely face humiliation. When I first arrived, you granted me the freedom of my younger years, a reprieve from intimacy, allowing my heart to remain calm and still. But today, you speak of truly becoming husband and wife. I would have to see you as my husband, not just His Majesty. I'm not quite ready. I have a dream, a wish to live like an ordinary woman with her husband, visiting the market, enjoying street food, buying cosmetics, watching performances, living together naturally, and then, only then, becoming husband and wife. If you can grant me this, then we can become husband and wife. This instant. If it's too difficult, then let us continue as before. Is that all right? In my presence, you can be jealous, capricious, even unreasonable. I will indulge you in all things, as long as you are willing to be my wife. He held her tightly, his embrace filled with longing, oblivious to his own strength. I wish things could remain as they are now, just the two of us, disguised in common clothes, spending a day in the capital. Amelia, I have no family, only you. Warmth flooded Amelia Mason's heart, the tangled emotions within her clarifying. She gently embraced his waist. I know. I will always be with you, Edward. Always and forever. Amelia. He trembled, kissing her soft, red lips once more. Eunuch Lawrence Park led Prince Carter and Chancellor Adrian Blake into the Queen's chambers. After settling them in the guest room, he went to announce their arrival, but couldn't help but take a few steps back at the door. His Majesty and the Queen were together all day, making it difficult for him to proceed or retreat. He decided not to enter, unwilling to interrupt the affectionate couple. Standing at the door, he announced loudly, Your Majesty, Prince Carter and Chancellor Adrian Blake are waiting in the guest room. Go sunbathe in the garden. I have matters to discuss with them. Come read to me later. Edward Windsor kissed Amelia Mason, releasing his hand and gazing deeply into her eyes. Amelia Mason nodded obediently, waiting for him to adjust her clothes before leaving the room. All right, have them come in. Edward Windsor said with a serious and composed expression. Now, he was a monarch. There were some people he had wanted to treat with kindness and generosity, asking nothing in return but their well-being. But now, this was no longer possible, so they couldn't blame him. If fate had brought him back here, some things had to end. Winter was approaching, and the Queen's winter wardrobe had been prepared in the royal tailor's workshop. For the past few days, Grace Mason hadn't had any free time. Today, since His Majesty was able to sit up and attend to matters of state, she gave some instructions to the young palace maids and prepared to go to the royal tailor's workshop. As soon as she reached the door of the Queen's chambers, she saw someone standing stiffly like a tree in the woods outside the palace, taking 2 steps forward and then 2 steps back, muttering incessantly. Grace Mason felt annoyed and quietly approached. It was that sneaky Prince Vincent Wilder again. Hey! Grace Mason playfully shouted, startling Vincent Wilder so much that he jumped. Seeing that it was the maid who served the Queen, he couldn't help but rejoice. Sister, are you leaving the palace? Who's your sister? Grace Mason glared at him angrily. He was clearly much older than her. Well then, little sister maid, could I ask you for a favor? He looked apprehensive and spoke cautiously. Don't call me such nonsense, Prince Vincent Wilder. What brings you to the Queen's chambers? Mother asked me to bring some bird's nest for the Queen to nourish her health. Please pass it on to her. He handed her the package he was holding. Such a small matter could have been handled by a servant. Why trouble your highness to deliver it personally? Since you're here, why not go in and see the queen? No, no, Vincent Wilder raised his eyebrows and glanced furtively at the queen's chambers. He heard that His Majesty was inside with the queen. Just thinking about His Majesty made his legs feel like they weighed 1,000 pounds, each step a mile. Is Her Majesty feeling better? Grace Mason calmly observed his flustered and awkward demeanor, and said with amusement, wouldn't you know if you went in to see her? Or are you using the excuse of giving a gift today, but actually have another motive you don't want anyone to know? No, no, Vincent Wilder raised both hands in a gesture of denial. Today, I truly came here on my mother's orders, not pretending. I'm also sincere, it's just that I lack a bit of courage. By the time he finished the last sentence, his voice had become almost inaudible. He lowered his head and suddenly sat down on the ground, tears falling. Grace Mason had never seen a grown man cry and was momentarily at a loss. She could only squat down beside him and softly comfort him, don't cry. If you don't want to go in, then don't. I'll tell her you came. Why are you acting like a child, always narrow-minded and fond of teasing others? I don't have any, but when I return, Mother will ask, and I won't be able to answer. She'll be upset for days. I don't dare go in because I'm afraid of His Majesty, afraid he'll blame me. Grace Mason didn't understand why His Majesty would blame him. Before, when others laughed at me for being a useless freeloader *, I swore I would accomplish great things to shock them to death. Unexpectedly, I really am a useless freeloader, and a big one at that. Vincent Wilder cried. Even harder. A good-for-nothing parasite. Grace Mason suppressed a laugh. Was there anyone who saw themselves this way? Prince Vincent Wilder isn't a useless freeloader. True freeloaders only see themselves as geniuses. Someone who calls themselves a freeloader is naturally a person of great wisdom. Haven't you heard people say, the greatest wise men feign foolishness *? A person of exceptional intelligence who pretends to be foolish, really? Vincent Wilder lifted his tear-filled eyes, asking with a naive and adorable look. Yes. He stopped crying and smiled. Thank you, palace maid sister. In a few days, when my youthful vigor is fully restored, I will come see the Empress again. Today, I'll just go back and think carefully first. All right. As long as he didn't cry, Grace Mason was fine with anything. She didn't want the other palace maids to see her making Prince Vincent Wilder cry like a child. Then I'll be going. Today, palace maid sister wasn't as fierce as last time. Vincent Wilder dared to steal a few more glances. She was truly beautiful. Go on. Grace Mason curved her lips into a gentle smile, not expecting to frighten him. About that, he looked at the paths in all directions, identical to each other. Which way had he come from? He hung his head dejectedly and said helplessly, Palace maid sister, could you take me to the royal palace gate? I'm a bit lost. Sigh, Grace Mason looked up at the sky inside. He truly understood himself. Indeed, he wasn't just a useless freeloader, but a colossal one. Let's go, Prince Vincent Wilder. I'll escort you out of the palace. She resignedly led the way. Vincent Wilder's delight was evident on his face as he followed. Ha, the palace maid sister was tricked. He just wanted to look at her a little longer. She was so kind. Chapter 12, Yearning Day and Night, Separated by a Long Road, Part 1. The storied tower stands tall and serene, gazing at the distant spring sorrow, a boundless melancholy arises. The faint light of the setting sun illuminates the grass, without words, who understands the orchid's intent? Thinking back to that initial madness, a drunken stupor, facing the wine and singing, forcing merriment, yet finding no joy. My belt gradually loosens, yet I have no regrets, for you, I've wasted away. These are the last two lines of the poem, Butterfly Love Flower, by a poet from the Northern Song dynasty. The original words express the author's lack of regret for the hardships of love. The young women of the renowned Apricot Blossom House, the wealthiest establishment in the capital, parted their cherry lips, their voices rising in song like nightingales, captivating every guest present. Within the Apricot Blossom House lay an elegant courtyard, exclusively reserved for the courtesan Yu to receive guests. It was said that Yunu's family were originally merchants from Jiangnan, but due to declining fortunes, she had drifted into this world of fleeting pleasures. Skilled in all the arts, music, chess, calligraphy, and painting, she was considered the foremost talent among her peers. Moreover, her beauty and gentle nature captivated numerous wealthy and powerful figures in the capital. Yet, Yunu remained virtuous, choosing to associate only with refined gentlemen of exceptional learning and talent, engaging in poetry and philosophical discussions. Thus, her reputation spread far and wide. Renowned title, a courtesy title used for prostitutes in brothels. Yet, Miss Nok No, usually aloof and haughty, today shed her usual detachment and shyness towards customers, her face filled with admiration as she watched the elegant man pouring and drinking wine before her. Lord Zhuangyuan *, does this song, Butterfly Love Flower, please you? She asked softly. Song, Duke, the first of the 5 peerage titles in feudal times. Nicholas Gray didn't reply, only raising his wine cup for a gentle sip. Hearing the familiar, soft voices from outside the courtyard, he flicked his sleeve, a gesture mirroring his inner turmoil. Until tomorrow, Amelia. The words still echoed in his ears, yet the chance to fulfill them was gone. He was a liar, breaking his promise. His indifference didn't quench Nok No's burning admiration, instead, it only fueled the flames. Who could believe it? Nicholas Gray, the most talented man in the world, had humbled himself to come to Apricot Blossom House, drinking and chatting with her. Moreover, he had specifically asked for her, without even glancing at the other courtesans. He was so exceptionally talented, young, handsome, and gentle, and seemed to favor her. Wasn't he the very reason she had painstakingly preserved her purity, enduring years of suppressed anger in this brothel? Though the melody was beautiful and the singing pleasant, he seemed not to hear, only giving her a dazed glance before burying his face back in his wine cup. What was he doing? Just because a new acquaintance had casually mentioned that Miss Nok No of Apricot Blossom House was known as the most talented woman in the world, her knowledge comparable to his, he had recklessly come here. Longing tormented him, keeping him awake at night. He only wanted to see the woman who seemed to bear a faint resemblance to Amelia Mason. In truth, he knew that in terms of knowledge, this woman couldn't compare to her. Her appearance wasn't as bright and lively, nor did she possess Amelia's strong and spirited demeanor. What was he trying to prove? Was he using this courtesan to mask his loneliness? Just thinking of that delicate figure made his heart clench in pain. He tilted his head back and drained his cup in one gulp. Did she even know? She had awakened feelings and desires he himself didn't understand. Forgetting wasn't as simple as deciding not to remember. It was as if she had seeped into him, becoming a part of him. He was, after all, only human. He could no longer maintain his former carefree detachment. He couldn't love her. She was young and already belonged to another, and that other was the current emperor. The thought itself was wrong, he knew this better than anyone, yet he couldn't help himself. He closed his eyes. Have you ever loved someone? He suddenly asked, turning his head. Nok No blinked. Not before, but perhaps now, I am beginning to. He shook his head with a bitter smile. If you love someone, but that person is someone you cannot love, what should you do? Heavens, so he loved someone. No wonder he was so despondent. Nok No felt a pang of bitterness. It turned out he hadn't come for her. What is love? I don't truly know. They ask, what is love in this world, that can make people face life and death? Love makes one unable to turn back, all involuntary. If you love, then love. If you cannot love, then watch from afar, loving silently in your heart. Nicholas Gray couldn't help but glance at the woman a few more times, recognizing that she was no ordinary person. Beauties abound in this world, yet you can only have one. But someone who offers delightful conversation is a different kind altogether. Consider her a confidant, a soulmate, you won't find it so bad. A wife has her charms, but a kindred spirit shares your heart. Look at it differently, Master Gray, and it won't be so unbearable. Admire her from afar, enjoy witty banter, exchange knowing glances and understand each other without words. What's not to like? The loneliness on Nicholas Gray's face vanished, his eyes shining brightly. Miss Maggie, you are truly a gentleman among women. Your words have parted the clouds and let me see the sun's star. I hadn't thought of it that way, only fixated on growing old together, unable to make it happen, and wallowing in regret. You're right, looking at it from a different perspective, it's not a wasted acquaintance. A good friendship can indeed last a lifetime. Parting the clouds and seeing the sun, a metaphor for understanding the truth behind superficial appearances. Maggie smiled faintly. I stand here every day amidst the moon and wind, showered with flattery, yet I know this isn't a noble place. It troubles me, but to survive, I must console myself. Maintaining purity in an impure place makes me no less virtuous than any other woman. Nicholas Gray was moved, gazing intently at her jade-like face. You are an extraordinary flower, a lotus blossom that remains untainted by the mud. Truly. She lowered her head, trembling slightly. Do you really see me that way? Truly. Nicholas Gray nodded emphatically, taking her soft hand in his. The place doesn't matter, it's the purity of your soul that counts, and you possess that. A single, crystal-clear tear traced a path down her rouged lips, but a beautiful, flower-like smile bloomed on her face. Nicholas Gray was captivated. Early winter, a light frost, a gentle breeze, and the sun shone beautifully. His Majesty, after more than a month of devotedly attending to the Empress, finally sat high upon the golden throne once more. His face was somewhat pale, but his spirits were good. He inquired about affairs of state, the situation at the border, made decisions with an impassive expression, and then adjourned the court. The officials murmured amongst themselves, observing that His Majesty hadn't seemed to neglect his duties during the past month. Edwin Thompson followed the others out of the hall, and a young eunuch approached him. General Thompson, His Majesty is hosting a banquet in Clara Thompson's honor within the palace today. He invites you and your wife to attend. Oh. What is the occasion for this banquet? The concubine is pregnant with a royal heir, and His Majesty is overjoyed. He's been distanced from her these past few days due to the Empress's illness. Now that he's free, he wishes to celebrate the concubine. Is that so? A cruel smile spread across Edwin Thompson's face. Thank you, eunuch. My wife and I will certainly attend the celebration. No need for. Thanks, General. Farewell. The young eunuch replied, then turned and left. Edwin Thompson frowned, strode quickly out of the palace gates, and galloped away. Your Majesty, this time you truly frightened me to death. Clara Thompson clung to Edward Windsor's chest, her voice a mix of playful reproach and genuine fear. More than 3 months pregnant, past the stage of morning sickness, her belly was noticeably rounded, her figure carrying the gentle plumpness of motherhood. Today, as soon as His Majesty finished court, he came straight here, saying he had neglected her for many days and would make it up to her today. He even ordered the palace maids to prepare the drawing room, intending to celebrate her pregnancy that evening. His Majesty had never treated her with such care, and though suspicious, she feigned delight. Gently stroking her belly, she asked coyly, Your Majesty, guess whether I'm carrying a boy or a girl? If it's a girl, she'll be my eldest princess. If it's a boy, I shall personally educate him, and then I intend to bequeath the imperial throne to him. His Majesty, for some reason, responded with utmost seriousness to her playful question. Truly? She thought, lying through her teeth. My beloved consort doesn't believe me. In the entire palace, only you carry a royal child. Who could compete with you? My imperial heir, how could I not be fair to him? Despite his words, Clara Thompson felt no joy, a shiver running down her spine. A sudden fear gripped her, but she shook her head, dismissing it as overthinking. His Majesty, seemingly oblivious, picked up a book and began to read leisurely. As dusk settled and the time for the banquet approached, General Edwin Thompson and his wife arrived with a package of tonics, William Carter with a cheerful countenance, and the Empress, silent and composed. Seeing her parents, Clara Thompson's face lit up with genuine warmth, her mouth overflowing with inquiries and affectionate greetings. Edward Windsor took his seat first, followed by the others. The atmosphere was relaxed, befitting a family gathering, free from excessive formality. After 3 rounds of drinks, Edward Windsor ordered the palace maids to close the drawing-room doors, dismissing all the servants, declaring his desire for a more informal setting. As the doors closed, Edward Windsor rose, his gaze fixed on Clara Thompson. To enliven our drinking, I shall recount an old tale. Edwin Thompson lowered his chopsticks, his eyes fixed on the king in surprise. William Carter nodded knowingly, while Clara Thompson shifted uneasily in her seat. Edward Windsor then turned to Amelia Mason, his voice cold, "You all know my birth mother was a palace maid. In my youth, I was not pampered, indeed, I faced hardship. Since ascending the throne, I vowed never to subject my children to such treatment. I believed that taking consorts was permissible, but having children should wait until I was truly mature and capable of protecting them, of providing for their every need." The palace felt cold, and the eunuchs and maids gossiped, whispering that I was impotent, not a true man, unable to father a child after all these years. I heard these rumors, but they went in one ear and out the other. Now, with Clara Thompson's pregnancy, my name is cleared. How could I not rejoice? Your Majesty. Clara Thompson stammered, rising to her feet, her face pale. But, Clara Thompson, I don't understand. Every time I lay with you, I give you a contraceptive. How did you get pregnant? Edward Windsor closed his eyes, his expression suddenly darkening, and asked loudly. Your Majesty, wasn't that a tonic? Clara Thompson trembled, unable to stand, and could only lean on the table. Edwin Thompson and his wife's faces instantly turned ashen, anxiously looking at Edward Windsor. Ha ha! Edward Windsor threw his head back and laughed. That was just me telling the royal physician to say whatever. How could it be a tonic? I haven't even found the mother of my heir yet. How could I so easily want a child? You're truly insidious. Clara Thompson collapsed onto the chair, not daring to look at him, sweat dripping down her forehead. Insidious? Haha, the insidious one is you. You must have thought I was impotent, so you cuckolded me with someone else, got pregnant, and blamed it on me. Who would dare to doubt it? I would have to believe it, wouldn't I? And you would become a meritorious subject. But the matter isn't that simple, I suspect there's more to it. Original text, illicit affair, referring to illicit sexual relationships, Chapter 13, yearning day and night, separated by a long road, middle, as expected, no banquet is ever truly joyous. Edwin Thompson and his wife, terrified, crawled from their seats to Edward Windsor, kowtowing desperately. Your Majesty, please forgive our daughter. For the sake of the affection you once shared, please pardon her this once. Pardon? General Thompson, how do you expect me to pardon her? Accept being cuckolded and let her give birth to a bastard. Cuckolded, meaning having been cheated on, no, please allow this old minister to take her back to our residence and discipline her. Haha, so easily said. I'd like to applaud your audacity. You dare to say such a thing? I haven't even blamed you for failing to raise your daughter properly, allowing her to become so debauched and bringing shame upon us. The palace rules were established by the late emperor, and I have no right to change them. This is a crime punishable by 9 familial exterminations. Edward Windsor coldly flung his sleeve, turning away, unwilling to glance at them again. Debauched, meaning morally corrupt and unrestrained, William Carter, sitting to the side, maintained his usual gentle expression, showing no surprise. Amelia Mason seemed even more detached, lost in her own thoughts. "Your Majesty." Clara Thompson, her makeup smeared from crying, went to Edward Windsor, clutching his robe and pleading, "Your Majesty, my father and mother know nothing. It's all my fault. Please spare them. I'm willing to bear all the blame." "Oh, really? I wouldn't have taken you for such a filial daughter. If you tell me who your lover is, and how he was able to enter and leave the palace so freely, I will spare them." "Ah." Clara Thompson opened her mouth wide, shaking her head in horrified denial. "Your Majesty, I can't say. I can't say." Edward Windsor smiled. "It seems his place in your heart is quite significant." "Guards." The guards, who had been waiting outside, pushed open the doors and entered. "Your servant awaits. Summon the palace maids." A moment later, a female official around 40 years of age, holding a book, arrived. "Your Majesty, may I inquire as to the reason for your summons?" "Lady official, you oversee all palace affairs. Tell me, how should a consort who commits adultery be dealt with?" The female official, stunned, looked at the kneeling Clara Thompson and mechanically replied, "According to the law, the consort and her lover should be executed by Lingqi *. Lingqi, also known as slow slicing, where the limbs are severed before the head. "No, no." Clara Thompson, terrified, clutched Edward Windsor's robe, wailing, "Your Majesty, you wouldn't be so cruel, would you? I've served you, we've shared intimate nights, haven't we, Your Majesty?" Edward Windsor closed his eyes, sighing heavily. "You brought this upon yourself. I can't save you." "Yes, we shared some intimate nights. I won't execute you by Lingqi, nor will I pursue your lover. Lady official, give the consort a cup of poison, let her depart in peace. As for General Edwin Thompson, in consideration of your status as a founding minister, I will strip you of all titles and confiscate your estate. You will be reduced to a commoner, returning to your ancestral home to tend a few acres and live out your days. If you make even the slightest stir I will hunt you to the ends of the earth and have you sliced into 1,000 pieces. Remember, I am the current Majesty, not some phantom you hold on to. Stir, any subtle movement or action, implying any attempt to undermine the court." "Yes, yes." Edwin Thompson trembled, utterly terrified, lying prostrate, not daring to look at His Majesty. He had thought His Majesty weak, but he was so ruthless and venomous. He had been truly blind, misjudged him completely. Regret, bitter regret, came too late. "Now, have the guests escorted out." "I have family matters to attend to," Edward Windsor said coldly. Lady Thompson, looking at her daughter sitting dazedly on the ground, could no longer hold back her tears, biting her lip to stifle her sobs. Edwin Thompson helped his wife up, his back bent, stumbling as they left. In a single moment, they had fallen from heaven to hell. Fate was unpredictable. Tears streamed down his face. "Consort, let's go." The female official lifted Clara Thompson, speaking indifferently. Such scenes no longer shocked her. Mistakes had consequences. The allure of power and privilege wasn't for everyone. "Your Majesty, aren't you afraid of retribution for such cruelty?" "Haha, if I were afraid, I might as well hand over the kingdom." "Clara Thompson, you thought your scheme was flawless but you were merely a pawn. Was it worth sacrificing the lives of your entire family? You had a choice, didn't you?" Edward Windsor said, his voice laced with sorrow. Flawless, referring to a fairy's robe with invisible seams, implying a seemingly perfect plan. Clara Thompson was stunned. Did she have a choice? Was it worth it? I will give you a proper burial, and a good excuse. Go now. Edward Windsor waved his hand, no longer wanting to see her, and let the female official take Clara Thompson away. Ah, it's getting late. I should return to my residence. William Carter calmly stood up, patting Edward Windsor's shoulder. Your Majesty, those who evoke pity often deserve their fate. Don't dwell on it. Edward Windsor's tense face relaxed slightly, and he gave a wry smile. Being the bad guy isn't easy, is it, brother? Truly not easy. You've just recovered, go rest early. I'll take my leave. William Carter glanced at the Empress at the next table, smiled faintly, and then left the palace. Amelia Mason rose, as usual in the king's study, and said to Edward Windsor, Your Majesty, if there's nothing else, I'll take my leave and return to my chambers. He embraced her gently and nodded. Be careful on your way back, and don't read too late. Yes, Your Majesty. She smiled and called for Grace Mason to return to their chambers. Edward Windsor stood in a daze for a moment, then said to the waiting guards, Seal this place off. Let the palace servants return to their homes. If he inadvertently investigated further, he feared there would be more bloodshed. Those he could spare, he should spare. They were merely servants, how much of the darkness and light could they truly grasp? The temperature dropped suddenly that night. Amelia Mason read for a short while, then feeling the chill, she went to bed early, allowing Grace Mason to retire as well. In truth, she wasn't particularly sleepy. She simply closed her eyes slowly, pondering certain matters. Suddenly, a corner of the blanket was lifted, and a tall figure slipped into the bed. In a moment, she was enveloped in a broad embrace. The familiar scent, tinged with the faint aroma of medicine, filled her senses. Her body stiffened, and she stammered, Your Majesty, you promised me. Yes, I promised you, and I will keep my word, Amelia. I will certainly wait until we can live like an ordinary couple before we formally wed. But tonight, I want to hold you. Is that all right? Edward Windsor spoke softly. After a month of recuperation, once he could sit up, he began stubbornly insisting on sleeping with her every night, claiming it was for the convenience of conversation. She reluctantly fetched a brocade blanket from another bed, but every morning, she would awaken under his covers, much to her embarrassment. In truth, she found she slept soundly in his arms, his presence had gradually become a habit. Yes. She turned, snuggling closer into his embrace. She knew his heart must be heavy. His warm chest felt like a blazing furnace, quickly warming her entire body. You're feeling a bit down, aren't you? She solicitously rubbed his back. Amelia, did you find me frightening today? In the darkness, he looked up and sighed deeply. No, this is the royal palace. You don't offend others, they will offend you. If you weren't like that, you would be defeated. That's the endless cycle within the palace. It's not a matter of frightening or not. He hadn't expected her, so young, to possess such discerning eyes. Unlike ordinary women who would blanch at such events, she calmly understood everything. Amelia, thank you for thinking that way. I was so afraid that seeing what happened today would make you distance yourself from me. He buried his face in her fragrant hair, his voice laced with worry. She smiled tenderly, like a blossoming flower, clinging tightly to him. I'm quite brave, you can rest assured. Having read much history, she considered today's events trivial. After speaking, she shyly mimicked him, kissing his temple in reassurance. This small gesture elicited a strong reaction from him. His body tensed, and his breathing grew ragged. Edward, did I touch your wound? Amelia Mason anxiously stroked his chest. Ah, it was burning hot. Amelia, can't I go back on my word? He gritted his teeth, his entire body's strength concentrated, as if he wanted to devour her right there and then. At this moment, she somewhat understood his unusual behavior, embarrassedly retreating. You can't go back on your word. I want a different beginning than others. She persisted. He carefully moved her away slightly, preventing her soft body from rubbing against his, and only after a while did he gradually calm down. Baring his teeth, he gently nibbled her small earlobe. As you wish, you little minx. I'll remember this, and I'll collect it back bit by bit later. Understood, Edward. By then, Amelia will definitely make you really, truly happy. Good heavens, did she really take him for a Buddha? She even dared to use such words to entice him. Gently embracing her, he leaned down for a light kiss, thinking, whatever, I'll kiss her enough first and faint afterward. It wasn't the same, truly not the same. When you loved someone, even just holding them like this brought joy to your heart, unlike before, when after making love, there was only loneliness, as if only the physical body remained. Half passion, half tenderness, he deepened the kiss. Neither of them fainted, only things changed a bit. She panted in his arms, her eyes misty, her expression intoxicated. He didn't adjust her, letting her find the most comfortable position in his embrace before softly saying, the situation in the Mongolian campaign isn't optimistic. We've been fighting for nearly a month and still can't retreat. To boost the morale of the soldiers, I might personally go to the battlefield. Edward, you must be careful. The battlefield is ever-changing, you must take care of yourself, she said worriedly. Are you worried about me? Of course. Then come with me and help. Their relationship had just improved a little recently, and he didn't want time and distance to estrange them again. Moreover, with her by his side, he could worry less about the daily court dispatches delivered by horse. Since ancient times, only His Majesty goes to war, never the Empress. The soldiers will laugh. Who said it's the Empress going to war? It's clearly my official going with me. He smiled. Ah, you want me to disguise myself as your official? Why not? Tenderly kissing her eyes, which sparkled with excitement, he truly looked forward to seeing her disguised as a man. Rules were made by people, and only people could break them. Why bind oneself in everything? In this life, he wanted to thoroughly spoil someone. If it wasn't proper, so what? Meaning I can leave the palace, right? Amelia Mason exclaimed joyfully. Ah, Edward, I'll go. I'll be obedient, I'll do my best to fulfill my duties. Oh my God, I'm really, truly happy. She'd heard that the road from the capital to the border crossed mountains and rivers, foreign lands and deserts, a sight to behold. She'd read about it in books, heard others describe it, but never had the chance to experience it herself. To be able to go there now was truly a dream come true. She was so happy she felt like she was flying. All right, Amelia. Edward Windsor chuckled, stilling his fidgeting form beneath the covers. I'm a bit tired today. Let's talk tomorrow. Can we rest now? If he didn't say that, she'd probably fuss till dawn. Yes. Amelia Mason quickly patted his chest. Sleep now, be good. She was playing the little mother again. Edward Windsor closed his eyes, letting her maternal instincts run wild. If she truly enjoyed being a mother, that would be wonderful. Then, the palace wouldn't be just a palace, but a family. He secretly yearned for that. Chapter 14, Yearning Day and Night, Separated by a Long Road, Part 2, Is It Worth It? Didn't you already make your choice? In the bedroom, Clara Thompson sat upright before her vanity, carefully applying her makeup. The mirror reflected a face as delicate and beautiful as a flower, a pity it would soon wither. At this moment, Edward Windsor's questioning words echoed in her mind. The wine the court lady brought was placed on the left. After delivering it, the lady retreated to wait outside the door, waiting for her to finish drinking before leaving. How ironic, the last person she would see in this world was a court lady she usually wouldn't even bother to look at. She no longer feared the sudden arrival of death, perhaps just numbness. Moreover, she had the child in her womb as company, so she wouldn't be alone. Stroking her slightly swollen belly, she could almost feel the baby moving inside. She had once vowed to give it the deepest love and the greatest happiness, all now washed away. But it didn't matter. In the next world, she could still love it the same way. Leaving it alone in this palace would be far more worrisome. Royal palace, like an iron cage, confining people and their conscience. Once, she was just a carefree girl, swinging on swings, chasing butterflies, embroidering flowers with the older sisters in the mansion, doing needlework, every day filled with joy and happiness. That year, at 15, beneath a pomegranate tree ablaze with red, he stood with a strikingly handsome smile, captivating her. She never dreamed there could be such a beautiful man in the world. He was charming, enigmatic, and brilliant. From then on, her gaze could not leave him. His mother and her mother were sisters. Back then, his mother, concubine Li, was the most favored concubine of the late emperor. He was His Majesty's most understood prince, also the one secretly supported by the ministers. No glittering jewel could outshine him. When he jokingly asked if she would agree to be his crown princess, she almost didn't hesitate to nod in agreement. She wanted to be with him, forever and always. This unprecedented desire burned through all her reason. She madly loved him, second Prince Sebastian Windsor. She willingly surrendered at his feet. But a person's future isn't something one can simply glimpse. When she was 18, the late emperor passed away. The crown prince became Edward Windsor, and he was sent to the distant Westport. She ran to her father, begging him to let her follow him to the ends of the earth. Her father slapped her, saying what was there to yearn for in a deposed prince? She was destined to be empress. She didn't desire the riches of an empress, she only wanted to be with him, in life and death. That night, she took a bundle of clothes and ran to his Carter Manor, kneeling before him, tearfully confessing her infatuation and begging him to take her away. He stroked her tear-stained face and shook his head, "Marry him. Later, when the younger prince rebels, you can coordinate with him from within the palace. How about that? Internal collusion, external collaboration, a coordinated inside-outside operation." She loved him, how could she refuse his request? She married, becoming empress, yet His Majesty never neglected nor truly favored her. Countless nights, she embraced His Majesty, thinking only of him. She waited for his return, to leave with him. One day, Prince Vincent Wilder of Arlingham entered the palace bearing gifts, and she was astonished to discover the servant behind the prince was him in disguise. The deeply buried passionate love flared up like a wildfire, scorching her heart and body. The fervent love, intensified by separation, became even more intoxicating upon reunion. After their intimacy, it felt as though they had never experienced such happiness. 2 months later, she discovered she was carrying his child. She hastily summoned him to the palace to discuss the matter. Unexpectedly, he was overjoyed. "I risked my life entering the capital for this very outcome, haha. That useless emperor can't father children, and you're pregnant. He'll naturally assume it's his. If I succeed in seizing the throne, you'll be my empress. Even if I fail, this child will eventually become His Majesty. This empire, one way or another, will belong to Sebastian Windsor. This is the consequence of appearing dangerous and underestimating my male lead." In the end, he lost both his child and the throne. She was merely a woman, not privy to such profound schemes, she only thought of him. Now everyone knows the plot has failed miserably. Does he know yet? If he does, what will he do? Regret her? Regret the child? No, Clara Thompson shook her head, he only regrets the lost throne. At this moment, she finally understood. From beginning to end, he never truly loved her, she was merely a convenient tool to be exploited. How long can one grieve the loss of a tool? Simply find another. Was it worth it? Whether it was or not, it's all over. If she hadn't met him, could she have loved His Majesty? She didn't know. His Majesty was a good man, lonely at heart. He didn't love his consorts but treated them with respect. He only cared for the bookish empress. People are truly fascinating. Who would have guessed His Majesty didn't love beauties but only a child? She truly envied that empress. The time has come. Clara Thompson released the comb in her hand, gazing at herself in the mirror one last time. Beautiful. In a few days, she would be nothing but bones. Tears silently fell onto the vanity table, tears she couldn't hold back. Is there anything in this world worth clinging to? She stood, trembling as she picked up the wine cup. I wish to understand the emperor, whose longevity is absolute. Though mountains crumble, rivers run dry, storms rage, snow falls in summer, and heaven and earth unite, may I endure like the emperor, lies, all lies. She closed her eyes and drained the cup in one gulp. Your Majesty. Grace Mason, her face pale and serious, entered the study within the Queen's chambers from the courtyard. Amelia Mason was bent over a painting. For days now, she hadn't spent her days reading, but painting, her clothes daily stained with a multitude of colors, yet she seemed tireless. She constantly painted towering mountains and cascading waterfalls, women in foreign attire, painting and painting, a smile often playing on her lips. Where have you been? She didn't look up, continuing to paint. I just visited Lady Clara Thompson, she's already been buried. Grace Mason didn't know the details, only that Clara Thompson had suddenly fallen acutely ill. Seeing the once vibrant Clara Thompson now silently depart from the world, she felt a pang of sorrow, especially considering the unborn prince in her womb. Amelia Mason paused her drawing, sat down, and said faintly, life and death are predestined, humans are powerless against them. Your Majesty, His Majesty didn't attend the funeral. Married for 3 years, His Majesty hadn't shown his face. It was unbelievable that even the monarch was just a heartless man. There have been many state affairs these days, His Majesty might be busy. She said casually, not surprised at all. Grace Mason looked at Amelia Mason with some worry, hesitating slightly. After His Majesty fell ill, it seemed his favor towards her mistress had increased, but how many monarchs could truly be single-hearted? What if one day His Majesty took a new concubine, what would her mistress do? Clara Thompson had also been favored 100 times more than this, yet she departed in loneliness. She truly dared not think further. Do what? Amelia Mason looked at Grace Mason for a long time without speaking, just standing there blankly, asking in a puzzled manner. Grace Mason bit her lower lip helplessly and whispered, Your Majesty, all the concubines in the palace serve only one monarch. The monarch's heart cannot be fair, he will naturally favor a certain concubine. When they are intimate, it's one thing, but if one day, his heart wanders, what should that concubine do? The corners of Amelia Mason's mouth curved upwards. Oh, that's simple. When favored by His Majesty, there's no need to do anything. When neglected, after the intimacy fades, there's no loss. Just do what you want. Life isn't entirely about love. There are many things to do, reading, playing music, traveling through mountains and rivers. Or, like Master Tao, picking chrysanthemums by the eastern fence, leisurely gazing at the southern mountains. Learning to farm isn't bad either, savoring the fruits of one's labor every day, it would feel very fulfilling. Grace Mason could only gape for a long time, her eyes blinking incessantly. Heavens! So that's how her mistress thought. Although surprised, she felt a bit of joy. She truly didn't want her beloved mistress to become a grieving woman, forever regretful and resentful. But after a while, she became uneasy again. But, mistress, this is the inner palace, how can one just leave as they please? Right, Amelia Mason raised her eyebrows smugly, then play music, read, paint, cultivate these activities like a field, growing melons and beans, a bean trellis with willow branches like silk, the harvest will be after sunset. The next day, take a lake in the palace, learn from Jiang Taigong and fish. Ah, so much to do, what's there to be sad about? Although the unease in her heart couldn't be dispelled, Grace Mason felt a little more at ease. After all, she would definitely follow her mistress for the rest of her life, even through fire and water, she would not regret it. She rolled up her sleeves. Your Majesty, let me grind the ink for you. What will you paint today? Amelia Mason said excitedly, paint the desert of Mount Yen. Your Majesty, are we not going in? Eunuch Lawrence Park softly asked Edward Windsor, who had been standing outside the door for a long time. His Majesty had come straight here after court was dismissed and happened to overhear the conversation between the Empress and her maid. After listening for a while, His Majesty's face became as cold as a 1,000-year block of ice. I won't go in. I've remembered there are still some memorials in the King's study that need reviewing. Let's go. With that, he flicked his dragon robe and turned to leave. It turned out she hadn't paid any attention to his feelings, thinking only of a future life without him. Without him, she could indeed live well, but without her, what would become of him? Ah, Edward Windsor gave a bitter laugh. Loving someone else, that little palace maid truly had a rich imagination. Since ancient times, monarchs have been heartless, but he wasn't like that. He was very clear-headed and seriously thought he only truly loved one person, and only wanted that person of his to love him the same way. This request wasn't excessive, but today, she didn't think so. Was it because his expression wasn't enough, or was he not doing well enough? He really had to think it over carefully. In the capital, in a narrow alley, in an ordinary house, Sebastian Windsor's face was ashen as he looked at Lacan's cold and brutal face. What did you say? Clara Thompson is dead? Yes, Your Highness. I just received a secret report from the palace. Lacan replied with an unchanged expression. How could this be? Tell me quickly, why did Clara Thompson die? On Sebastian Windsor's usually calm and unruffled face, rare anger and agitation appeared. The sudden news disrupted his normally steady emotions. I heard it was an acute illness, but I couldn't inquire about the specifics. The night before, there was a banquet for the family members in the palace. Now, Clara Thompson's palace maids and eunuchs have all been dismissed and sent home. What about Edwin Thompson? He went home a few days ago, saying he was retiring to his hometown. I pursued him, and on the way, I saw a heavy guard escort. I couldn't get close. How can it be so coincidental? Clara Thompson dies, and Edwin Thompson immediately goes into seclusion. This matter isn't that simple. Sebastian Windsor narrowed his eyes and said coldly. Suddenly, he grabbed Lacan and asked urgently, or was there an informant? Your Highness, that's impossible. Anyone in the palace who had a bit of information, I killed them. Even Prince Vincent Wilder doesn't know the real situation. Lacan said firmly. Sebastian Windsor slumped back into his chair in defeat. He and Edwin Thompson had conspired this plan long ago. He knew Edwin Thompson was a blade of grass, unable to withstand the strong wind from the other side. At first, seeing him as the late Emperor's prince, he flattered him desperately. Later, when Edward Windsor became His Majesty, he hurriedly married his daughter into the palace, wanting to climb into the royal family. Unexpectedly, in 3 years, Clara Thompson didn't give birth to a single child. He started to get anxious, worried that His Majesty's body had some unmentionable problem. Without children, and with the Empress not being one of his own, he would have no support. After Sebastian Windsor returned, he sought him out and told him his plan. He was overjoyed and hurriedly borrowed Vincent Wilder's power, arranging for him to enter the palace to meet Clara Thompson, until she became pregnant. Everything was flawless, so where did it go wrong? Now, his power could rival Edward Windsor's, so he had formulated this perfect plan. What should he do next? Your Highness, if not, I will enter the palace and attempt another assassination. This time, I will definitely not fail. Locke stepped closer and whispered. No, Sebastian Windsor shook his head. He won't be that foolish. The guards must be heavily reinforced now. Getting close is easier said than done. You are my most capable assistant. I don't want anything unexpected to happen to you. So there's no other way. We need to think carefully. In the court, we still have a few ministers, that fool Vincent Wilder, the Mongols haven't retreated yet, Edward Windsor must also have weaknesses. We don't need to act rashly, let's bide our time and wait for the right moment, never to fail again. A cruel, icy glint flashed in Sebastian Windsor's eyes as he spoke. What about Clara Thompson? Sebastian Windsor's cold, ruthless heart softened a little. She has always been utterly loyal to me, I will remember that. But I can't be swayed by womanly sentiments. This revenge, sooner or later, must be taken. For now, let it go. And the child, does your Highness want to go and bid farewell? No. Sebastian Windsor coldly shook his head. His concubines in Westport had already borne him 3 sons and 5 daughters. He had originally intended to use this unborn child to control Edward Windsor. Now that Clara Thompson was dead, and the fetus was still unformed, what was there to bid farewell to? Locke glanced at him and didn't mention it again. His Highness was right, a man undertaking great things couldn't be swayed by womanly sentiments. He had been a bit overly concerned. Go, investigate quickly. In a few days, find a quiet place. I want to meet Vincent Wilder. Sebastian Windsor ordered with a grim, sinister expression. Yes. Locke replied, and in the blink of an eye, he vanished without a trace. Sebastian Windsor clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly in the room. Night was approaching, and he liked the night. The night concealed all light, making him feel safe. Now, he was safe. Chapter 15, Leaving Home Together, A Long and Winding Road, Part 1, Liangzhou City, bordering Mongolia, was considered a crucial frontier fortress. Before the war, the entire city was bustling with prosperity and vibrant life. Although the two countries did not officially trade, the people along the border could freely conduct business and even marry across borders. Despite the disagreements between their rulers, the people lived peacefully and prosperously. Unexpectedly, the Mongolian king harbored great ambitions, determined to conquer the south and expand his grassland territory. He spared no effort in assembling 200,000 troops, preparing provisions, and launching an attack on Liangzhou City. As a result, the people outside Liangzhou City had fled, fields were abandoned, doors were shut tight, and the streets were deserted. Inside the city, the stench of swords, gunpowder, and an unprecedented tension filled the air. War was a cruel thing. After several fierce battles, the smell of blood hung heavy over Liangzhou City like a net. Inside the city, corpses and wounded soldiers and civilians lay scattered everywhere, a horrifying sight. The northern winter was particularly cold and dry. The fierce wind, like a sharp blade, whipped across their faces, causing stinging pain and chapping the hands and feet of the defending soldiers. But no one paid attention to this, their eyes remained vigilant, staring into the distance. Several days of heavy snow had halted the fighting, and the Mongol army had retreated 20 miles, but no one dared to relax. It could be another Mongol trick. Eleanor Bennet, with furrowed brows and a grim expression, stood on the city wall, gazing intently at the vast, boundless desert. Such weather severely depleted the soldiers' fighting strength. Within the city, provisions were dwindling, the number of sick and wounded was increasing, the new year was approaching, and the people's morale was unstable. All of this was unsettling. Although there were reports that the court's provisions were not far from Liangzhou City, every day they didn't arrive was a day of hardship. If the Mongol army attacked at this moment, how should he respond? General, Deputy General Tun Kui Dain's urgent voice pulled Eleanor Bennet back from her battle-plan deliberations. What is it? Eleanor Bennet turned, casually brushing off the snowflakes that had settled on her. Tun Kui Dain looked at the figure before him, clad in thin, short-sleeved silver robes, the same color as her armor, fastened at the chest with a cross-shaped knot. The round iron plate on her chest gleamed brightly under the snowy light, and a black cloak billowed behind her in the wind. The general's heroic and awe-inspiring posture, coupled with her distinguished demeanor, filled him with respect. Despite having only been promoted to general for nearly 2 years, Eleanor Bennet had earned the deep affection and respect of the soldiers. A fierce warrior and brilliant strategist, she also cared deeply for her troops. This Mongol invasion, thanks to the army's preparedness, had seen the enemy repelled time and again, leaving Liangzhou city unscathed. What is it, Kui Dain? Has something untoward happened? Eleanor Bennet asked. Her deep, resonant voice projected a calm and steady nature. General, we just received a letter from the imperial court. His Majesty intends to personally lead the troops, and is currently selecting elite soldiers and skilled generals. They will depart in a few days. Tun Kui Dain said excitedly. Is this true? Eleanor Bennet strode forward, gripping Kui Dain's arm in inquiry. Kui Dain nodded vigorously. Eleanor closed her eyes, looked skyward, and sighed. Our ruler is wise. With His Majesty leading the charge, morale will surely soar. Reinforcements are also arriving. With all this, we need not fear failure in breaking the enemy. Those barbaric Mongols will surely be bound hand and foot. Tun Kui Dain's face lit up with joy. I hope the war will end soon. Though born a soldier, I still believe killing is barbaric. I share your sentiment. Without war, the people could farm their land and live in peace. But now, they are displaced, unable to bear even a single day more. I only hope His Majesty's army arrives soon to change this situation. I pray for peace in the realm. Even if I can no longer fight on the battlefield, I will rejoice. Such a sentiment would bury a brilliant general. Tun Kui Dain sighed. It's all right. As an ordinary farmer, I would also have my own joys. Truly, it has been an honor to serve alongside the mighty General Bennet. Tun Kui Dain suddenly felt a pang of regret. Why so sentimental? You are still in the army, aren't you? We still have a great battle ahead. While those are our aspirations, not everyone shares them. Human nature is greedy, otherwise, the Mongols wouldn't be encroaching on our borders. You and I, we aren't destined for the simple farmer's life just yet. Eleanor Bennet said with a laugh. Tun Kui Dain nodded awkwardly. Deputy General Tun, enough with the melancholy. Come with me back to headquarters to deploy the maps and analyze the enemies and our own forces. It has been many days, and we cannot afford any mishaps. Liangzhou city can't withstand any more losses. All right. After briefly consoling the valiant yet adorably simple vice-general, Eleanor Bennet looked up at the thick clouds rolling in from the distant desert, aware that a life-or-death battle was imminent. Today, Queen's chambers had quite a few visitors. Grace Mason, having risen early to tidy the Queen's bedroom and study, had just closed the door when she encountered a worried-looking chambermaid talking to someone. Approaching, she saw it was Lord Nicholas Grey, whom she hadn't seen in days. Greetings, Lord Grey, she said, curtsying smoothly and simultaneously signaling the chambermaid to withdraw. Seeing Grace Mason, Nicholas Grey breathed a sigh of relief and stepped forward, asking softly, "Is Her Majesty in Queen's chambers?" Grace Mason's delicate face turned blank. "May I ask what urgent matter brings Lord Grey to seek Her Majesty?" she inquired quietly. Nicholas Grey stammered slightly, a touch embarrassed. "I had an appointment with Her Majesty for tomorrow, but unforeseen circumstances arose, and I failed to keep it. I came today to apologize." Grace Mason rolled her eyes, recalling that such an arrangement had indeed been made. Back when His Majesty was ill, the Queen and Lord Grey reviewed memorials together nightly. After His Majesty recovered, Lord Grey was appointed Imperial Academician and ceased his visits to the palace. But if it was a matter of state, there was no need for a secret rendezvous between the Queen and Lord Grey, so what was there to apologize for? Lord Grey, Her Majesty has instructed that she wishes to be undisturbed in her studies, regardless of who calls. I will inform Her Majesty of your visit when I bring in her meal, if that is acceptable. Lord Grey looked disappointedly towards Queen's chambers, clearly not seeing Amelia Mason. He had finally secured an opportunity to enter the palace while His Majesty was away on campaign, hoping to see the woman he so admired. To think she wouldn't receive visitors. Frustrated but resigned, he nodded to Grace Mason. Very well. Please tell Her Majesty that she once spoke of visiting Virtue's Haven with scholars to compose poetry. Ask her if she remembers. Yes, I will certainly relay your message to Her Majesty. Is there anything else, Lord Grey? Nicholas Grey blushed. Is Her Majesty well? She's probably doing just fine, Grace Mason thought to herself. Traveling with His Majesty over mountains and through towns, who knows how delighted she must be. She had been left behind in the palace to keep up appearances, feeling both resentful and worried. Her mistress had never been apart from her for more than half a day. Her Majesty is very well, reading, painting, and in excellent spirits, she replied. That's good. Nicholas Grey lowered his head, avoiding Grace Mason's gaze. Then I shall take my leave. Farewell. Grace Mason escorted Nicholas Grey to the palace gates, suppressing a smile as she watched him shake his head and sigh, finding his awkwardness endearing. After seeing Nicholas Grey off, Grace Mason slowly returned to the palace. Reaching the grove outside the palace, she suddenly looked up, rolling her eyes. Prince Vincent Wilder, she said wearily, would you mind not lurking about like a thief and instead walk openly? Vincent Wilder grinned sheepishly, emerging from behind a tree. Caught again. How are your eyes so sharp? I thought I'd found a truly safe hiding spot. That's because you're a goof, hiding your head but not those big feet sticking out, Grace Mason thought with a chuckle, then said aloud, Prince Vincent Wilder, the Queen has been well these past few days. His Majesty is away on a personal expedition. May I ask what brings you to the palace? Do you know why His Majesty is on this expedition? I hear the battlefield is a dangerous place, where blades and arrows have no eyes, he said with a grave expression. Grace Mason glared at him. His Majesty hasn't explained it to me, but I presume it's for the court and the country, something I doubt Prince Vincent Wilder would understand. He caught the barb in her words and sulked for a moment before brightening. I'm only worried about His Majesty. He's not a bad man. Though I'm untalented, I still understand some principles. Oh. He wasn't entirely foolish, and his heart seemed to be in the right place. Grace Mason ignored him and focused on returning to the palace. To her annoyance, he followed. Why are you following me? Grace Mason whirled around and snapped. He took a few steps back with a smile. Miss Grace Mason, are you busy today? I have many duties, Prince Vincent Wilder. Also, the Queen isn't receiving visitors today. Please return to your residence. Go straight along this path through the woods, turn left at the bend, continue forward, then turn right, and you'll find the palace gate. She wanted to be rid of him and his pestering. Vincent Wilder waved his hand dismissively. I'm in no hurry. He suddenly fixed his gaze on her. Do you ever wish to leave the palace and live a normal life? Huh? His question stunned her. She furrowed her delicate brows. Why would you ask such a strange thing? I want to care for the Queen. Of course, I must stay in the palace. How could I leave? Not even to marry. Had Prince Vincent Wilder taken the wrong medicine today? He was spouting nonsense. Grace Mason closed her eyes, then opened them slowly. Prince Vincent Wilder, where are you right now? The palace. So, can a palace maid leave to marry? He shook his head, then his eyes widened in sudden realization. Grace Mason is a palace maid. He clutched his head, crouched down, and yelled, "No, no. I don't want Grace Mason to be a palace maid. I hate this royal palace." Grace Mason clapped a hand over his mouth in alarm. "Quiet, Prince Vincent Wilder. Do you want to get me killed? I'm a maid who came with the Queen, I must serve her for life. I'm happy here. Don't do anything foolish." All right, he pushed her hand away, about to speak, but seeing her look, he swallowed his words. "What's so good about the palace? The outside world is much more interesting. If you had the chance to leave, would you?" Grace Mason sighed, looking at him. "Of course, it would be nice to leave, but only with the Queen. Have you ever heard of a queen living outside the palace? What if Her Majesty grants her permission to leave the palace? We'll deal with that later." Grace Mason looked at him, unwilling to argue, and answered casually. Overjoyed, he excitedly grasped Grace Mason's hand. "I, Prince Vincent Wilder, will certainly petition the Empress for your release from the palace." Grace Mason gave him a puzzled look, forcefully pulled her hand away, and, no longer wanting to speak with him, said, "Prince Vincent Wilder, I, Grace Mason, have many duties within the palace. Could we discuss this another time?" All right, I'll come find you again in a few days." Since His Majesty wasn't in the palace, he had nothing to worry about. Being able to see Grace Mason secretly filled his heart with joy. "Then, I won't see you out. Be careful on your way." Grace Mason didn't turn back, walking away without paying attention to the lovesick gaze behind her. Having just sent Vincent Wilder away and while instructing the young palace maids to sweep the courtyard, Grace Mason was surprised by the arrival of the ever-haughty Sophia Bennet. She hurried to greet her and invited Sophia Bennet into the guest room. Sophia Bennet